Hi, welcome to the Lead by Design show. I'm your host, Dev Singh. I have a question for you. What does it mean to lead by design? Exploring that question is the basic premise of this show, where I speak with inspiring leaders about leadership, design, agility, innovation, and many other things in between. I hope you enjoy this episode as much as I did, and I hope that in some way it inspires you to be a more mindful and conscious leader in your own life. I had the privilege of participating in a workshop that Stephen ran, and I was almost immediately inspired. When we met, there was a certain vibe that I feel I picked up on that was incredibly inspiring, and it resonated with me because I knew that although you were talking about certain concepts and teaching certain things in the context of the training that we met in, which was an Agile Foundations course, there was an underlying burning desire I could tell that you had to reach into the depths of the philosophy that underpinned everything that we were talking about. And it was from that moment that I saw an aspirational element of myself in not only what you were doing, but how you were coming across, the energy that you brought to the room, the passion that you brought to the room. And also I was incredibly inspired by the thread of sincerity and genuineness that went through everything that you spoke about and the way that you spoke about the things that you talked about. So I'd like to introduce you, firstly, Stephen, but before that, welcome to the show. Thanks for being here.
Fantastic. Thank you.
All right. So Stephen lives and breathes Agile and has trained, evangelized, coached, and directed Agile across a wide range of industries, both domestically and internationally. He's the current Chief Purpose Officer at Nomos Co., and his personal mission is to make work more human. Stephen co-designs organizations for empathy and agility, emphasizing a more human purpose to work. His self-described superpowers are personal grit and endless energy, and he thrives in contexts where leaders desire change and share his agenda of growing people, building purpose, and creating environments for incredible business outcomes. So Stephen, thanks again for being here. I have a lot of questions to ask you. As I mentioned just before we hit the record button, we might have to do a part 2 if it works out because of so much ground I want to cover. And I'm going to say up front that there are a lot of basic concepts that you have a rich wealth of knowledge on, experience on, and resources on. And I'm going to share a lot of those in the show notes so that we don't have to cover a lot of the basic stuff. So the audience for this conversation, I'm hoping, is going to be really aspirational leaders who want to gel and vibe and learn from the kind of philosophy that you and I really believe in and care about, so that we can assume that there is a basic understanding of concepts like Agile and design and whatnot. I will ask you some of it, but I'm hoping we can go a little bit deeper. And to kick things off, I actually have a very simple question for you, but I'm sure this will unpack some interesting directions. So in your bio, it says Stephen co-designs organizations for empathy and agility. What's the relationship between empathy and agility?
I don't think that in the current state of the art, whether people who are coaching executive coaches for performance, etc., who might care about empathy, necessarily connect that learning and that personal growth to business agility, which is the ability to respond to change. Conversely, Agile coaches that coach organizations to make them more agile in terms of responding to change don't often connect that to caring about other people, whether those be people inside your team, actually the customer, or everything from shareholders to your wider stakeholder group. So to me, trying to do those two things at the same time is one will feed the other. Like a wholly agile organization can buy itself the time, the space, the energy, the chance to have the privilege to really think about an empathetic place to be in work. And then teams that care about their customer and have empathy for each other and their customer, etc., will often find, a way, a better how by being agile. So I think there are synergies to be gained, but the state of the art doesn't connect them very well. Therefore, I feel it's a mission to make sure that the message comes out in both. When you buy one, you get the other.
What do you mean when you say state of the art?
In connecting with my peers in the two worlds, the two towers of people who are executive coaches, performance coaches, they talk to CEOs and they help make them better people and better leaders. that is a domain of learning and knowledge and growth. That's not the same domain and knowledge and learning of growth as agile coaches, scrum masters, people selling scaling frameworks, etc. So the state of the art, what they talk about, what they post about on LinkedIn, what they blog about, what they write about, the books that come out, those two topics, I've never seen a book that is Ikigai and Scrum in the same breadth. That's an example of the kind of overlap that I deeply care about.
So I was reflecting on this recently, and it didn't even occur to me to ask you this, but this really would be interesting to get your take on it. So I got into coaching. You might remember this from our earlier conversations. I got into coaching way before I had any concept of what Agile was. And even before I had a concept of organizational design. My coaching background is more from a psychotherapeutic modality. And I'm really interested in behavioral psychology and then by virtue of that, to some extent, performance psychology in terms of what makes people work better, not necessarily at work, but just in life in general. And it's really hard selling coaching to businesses and organizations and leaders in the sense of being able to say, we can make you better. And by virtue of that, your personal development will lead to business results and business transformation. Now, all of a sudden, Agile comes along. Well, not now, but maybe a decade, 15 years ago, Agile comes along, not in terms of the concept, Agile has existed for a long time, but in terms of the trend in the industry and sweeping beyond IT and tech industries, sweeping into banking, healthcare, all sorts of places, that government, as you've worked with many of these industries yourself. And suddenly people say, oh, I want a coach. I want an Agile coach. And I think, how much does this notion of Agile actually take away from the virtue of developmental or transformational coaching, but reconciling with the fact that, in a sense, it's actually given a platform for people to invest in this notion of coaching, and Agile has acted like a very convenient Trojan horse to bring real personal development into business. I'm not even sure what the question is there, but some thoughts to ponder on that I've been thinking about. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I will share that recently, we've always had a director of agility who sells it in the traditional Australian sense of agility, business agility, learn Scrum, learn Lean, learn these good practices to visualize things and put in a Duracell. We have also, as Nomos, separately, a people and development coach. It's a person who is an outlet on top of normal managerial and career coaching, on top of Nomos' secret sauce of coaching people about their self-actualization and purpose, but a performance coach, like a mental health friend, a person who helps them through, as they get promoted, things like imposter syndrome, etc. Now, this person, Jen, her name is Jen Parker, absolutely wonderful addition to our organization. It's been around for many years. Her and Keng, our current director of agility, had a conversation about how do we take some of Jen's services that she's providing to us, Nomos, internally, as she grows and is an entrepreneur within our business to build her own line of practice. Where's the overlap between the work that she does as an executive and performance coach with the work that Keng does, which is an Agile coach? And I kind of talked at and around each other for a little bit. It was a very interesting Venn diagram when I think they both came to the realization that the overlap is, they both maybe came to it going, you don't really know what I do, but I have no idea what you do. And I don't think that you do what I do. When they both discovered, oh, don't we do the same thing? And then actually found a way harder post that conversation to articulate what do performance, executive, and those kind of psychology and behavioral coaches bring to the table that Agile coaches aren't so good at doing, and what are the unique, skills, value add, etc., that Agile coaches bring that, vice versa. I think they landed on the answer. Like, generally, there's a certain psychology, behavioral psychiatry almost thing that an Agile coach that comes from more of, a project management background in general is not so equipped to deal with. And conversely, with your ex-project managers that are recurved to being Agile coaches, there's certainly a more engineering nuance, charting and visualization and analysis aspect that executive coaches aren't so into. So I think my journey in understanding it within our organization in order to sell it has paralleled your observation of, okay, how Trojan horse can one be for the other?
Okay. Do you feel any ethical conundrums about that?
If only in the sense that if we don't directly say it, then I feel like we've misrepresented it. That would certainly violate an ethical perspective in that your customer who receives this service is not informed. They haven't exercised their informed consent. I do think that Agile coaches say that they do coaching, all the behaviors, activities, etc., in service of making the organization more agile, which sometimes, oftentimes, may include not having people who just refuse to adopt it, like, positive attrition. Sometimes I do advise organizations, hey, there is a certain percentage of people that will inevitably leave your organization as a result of moving towards this culture. And I honestly, I think that's normal, natural. We're transparent about the fact that it's in service of the organization, even if it isn't in service to an individual's employment prospects. Conversely, I know that professional coaches, they'll often sign a code of ethics that says they're not doing it for any other reason other than benefiting the person. So there certainly is this gray area that you have to sort of uncover to say, like, if you had one coach doing both services, is that coach helping you, the individual, or they're helping the organization? So toward that end, our solution around it is to provide those as separate services. They might be handholdy, but they have, where the objectives are orthogonal to each other, you have separation of concerns.
Okay. Can you have one without the other to the extent where it becomes an issue, where that lack of integration can start to fester, perhaps?
Sure. I think one without the other is actually really typical of most like services or programs. So if you had a program in an organization where it was just about coaching executives, which is not atypical, you're not going to get Agile business benefits because it's not like the personal coach is going to tell an executive, hey, you should consider turning these 5 teams into Scrum teams and they should build backlogs and things. So it's not bad in and of itself, but I don't think you're hurt in any way. There's probably an opportunity cost, say.
Okay.
On the other hand, I do think that Agile coaches are less effective having had not talked to leadership in such a way as they can transform themselves, grow themselves, and become role models for the real change. So I think that does tangibly have an impact on the effectiveness of an Agile transformation coming at it that way, much more so than an opportunity cost. Is actually a drag on the organization's ability to change. Like if leaders don't genuinely also want themselves to change.
Yeah. Okay. Your role at the moment is Chief Purpose Officer. I'm really curious. I know you've talked about this before on various channels, but I'm curious, starting with the basics, why Chief Purpose Officer? How did you come up with that title? And what's your purpose these days?
Sure. Let me start backwards. My purpose is to make work more human. I think that if that's the vision, then the current mission, at least, is to basically build and design organizations that I run, like Coursquare, a nonprofit, and No Moss, our consultancy, that are from the ground up as radically designed toward that, revolutionarily designed toward that as possible. More on that momentarily. And my job title reflecting my intent to do that. It just so happens that thankfully via No Moss, the consultancy, we have the wonderful privilege to work alongside banks and telcos and startups and nonprofits that I can advise them, their leaders, their teams, their mid to whatever, so that they tweak their design of their organization, their flow of work, the way that they do work, who they hire, even the behavioral change and cultural goals that they set for themselves. That is an evolutionary approach to making their work more human. So that's my personal mission, make work more human. The 2 modes are evolutionary, revolutionary. Revolutionary is about running these organizations. Evolutionary is about selling it as a consultancy. And I think, certainly time has proven definitely the evolutionary part can generate big bucks that enable me to feed, live in a capitalist system, and I'm comfortable with that, to take that money and use it for the grander purpose. So then if we drill down into, okay, at No Moss, my job title specifically is Chief Purpose Officer, then within my personal mission to make work more human, there are lots of ways in which work can be made more human. And I think that working in a high performing way, like an Agile or Scrum or Lean or whatever, can generate like an abundance, like an excess of profit, time, capital, people's energy, such that you can re-leverage that abundance to invest in things that are higher up on said Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So if men, women, and children working in and around Nomos don't have to worry about the paycheck that comes on the table, paying enough, career progression, even just things like psychological safety and belonging in the teams, whether that be core score or Nomos. Instead, they can focus on things that are a lot higher up, like what do I really want to do, like self-actualization, doing every day, putting sweat into the things I actually care about. If those things are actually their job, maybe they just want to be a great consultant, and many Nomosers do, but also things that are adjacent to it, like learning software development skills so that you can start a computer game company. Again, that's a real Nomos case study, right? So it's an adjacent business that we've invested in. To things that are very orthogonal, like I just want to do this so that I can buy a house so my children can live in. I mean, they're not opposed to being a good consultant in any way. Your purpose statement, that self-actualization, can support your day-to-day work and continue the wheel turning of that abundance. And we call all of that, by the way, our purpose framework for growing people, self-actualizing them and self-transcending them. So as effectively the CEO, the chief executive officer, the name of any other person that performs that role is about them making executive high-level decisions on behalf of the organization, up to and including the products, services, everything they provide. So to me, I'm just coloring in that line, that beautiful outline of what can a CEO do, of the infinite number of things the CEO can do. My role at Nomos is specifically about creating frameworks so that people can find their purpose inside that framework, addressing our audience and our hiring audience, the supply side of a consultancy. And then in doing so, those people, like is in our UXs, our agile coaches, our technologists, can serve our customers in then asking them that question. What is the purpose of this product and service and organization you're doing? What is the good that your nonprofit or bank or telco does in the world? How can we support you in doing that? Purpose is not the only thing that makes us more human, but I think it's a very big thing that when you ask that question, a lot of the self-transcendent, fundamental, higher up there Maslow's hierarchy of needs type truths drop out. And I think that's a very useful way to frame my point of difference from what I would consider my CEO peers.
I love how in your culture book, which is on the Nomos website, and I'll put it in the show notes as well, you specify pretty clearly that, very explicitly, that not everybody has the luxury necessarily to pursue their purpose or to think about it, even depending on their life circumstances, depending on their geographical circumstances, their political circumstances, but socioeconomic, all of those things might put them in a position in their life where they just don't have the luxury to do that. And it's a privileged thing to be able to, I guess, not have to worry about lower rungs of Maslow's hierarchy of needs and be able to say, okay, I'm at a point where I can explore self-actualization.
Yes.
I'm really curious to ask you how you got to a point of saying, I'm okay to start thinking about my purpose now. Because I know you come from a refugee background yourself. And I listened to, as I mentioned earlier, I listened to another podcast that you did about a year or 2 years ago, maybe. I'll put the link in the description. It was a great conversation. But you sort of brushed over that topic a little bit. And one thing that really stands out about you to me that I admire and I respect a lot personally, and it's just a really personal thing, you have a great vocabulary, not just a vocabulary in terms of language, but a vocabulary of concepts, philosophical concepts that are things that I would describe that people can go down a Wikipedia rabbit hole of exploring. A lot of it is informed by Greek philosophy, moral philosophy. I'm really curious how you grew up to get to a point where you became that version of yourself now and got to a point of saying, yeah, okay, I've got everything sorted enough that I can start exploring my purpose.
That's a very good question. Thank you. Well, I forget which American founding father said it, and I paraphrase exactly the quote here, but there's something like, I, as a founding father of this nation, study the arts of war and politics such that my children can study the arts of medicine and engineering and so on, so that we can build a society in which we want to live, and so that their children can study the arts of poetry, music, and pottery. I only read that fairly recently, last maybe 3 or 4 years, but it kind of was an articulation, at least, of, I suppose, a life philosophy that I've grown into. I definitely say that. I mean, I hear my relatives, because we're two generations of refugee, not just my parents' generation, but their parents too, from different countries in Asia. Yeah, yeah. So they
It was
have
John Adams, by
stories.
the way. You have that
John
quote
Adams,
in the
there you go,
culture
yeah.
book as well. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you. You've done more research than I can remember, which is why it's very important to write it down. But they have stories. Like my grandpa would tell me stories about how much he loved living on the farm, for example. And we come from like a total middle of nowhere. Even now in modern southern China, you have to drive to you have to train to some obscure side station, and then you drive for another 3 hours down some pothole filled area to get to it. And I had the privilege of going about 15 years ago, 10 years ago now. But he would describe when he was a boy, how if and when the famine came, which they did regularly, and the rice failed or whatever it was, they would have to do things like rip bark off the tree, boil it into a soup that was totally not nutritious for you, but it had like something in it that if you drank the hot bark broth, it would stave the hunger off just a little bit. I remember my parents' generation telling me about the Civil War that they were in, the Vietnam War they were in, and my father fought in, and then what it was like to be refugees in the boat. And those experiences of fleeing with just the clothes on your back. My mother was very rich, in a family of many kids, and to the point where my maternal grandfather had other mistresses and other families that he was able to look after. They went from that kind of wealth where they live in multi-room and house mansions to the great equalizer being refugees. So I think about that a lot. And I think about, my grandfather and my father's generation being people that worried about politics and war because they didn't have a choice not to. And I suppose I am eager, almost anxious, almost impatient to want to get there real soon. Does that make sense? If they studied it, then I'm the middle bridging area. I study the arts of engineering and stuff, which I do. I'm a building generation to allow my daughter or my children's generation and their peers the ability to study things that are more artful. But I suppose both caution and impatience play a role in this. I'm cautious, such that if I also don't study the arts of politics and war, that our world might revert to a point where we just need to keep doing it again. That's dangerous. That's scary to me. And so I want others to know it and care about it and do things now to stop that from happening. And I want to experience the joys of what I want to give to my daughter, things like art and poetry and all that sort of thing. So there's no reason to stop and wait. So I don't see why one should not synthesize all three generations of these arts and these purposes in life into one, because in a human life, you can be many different people in many different ways, all kind of at the same time. Maybe definitely education plays a strong part. I grew up in northwestern Melbourne, where I was like, the only Asian kid in a moderately impoverished socioeconomic area. And if I had never gotten into Melbourne High School, which is at the time at least Victoria's only selective school, definitely the trajectory of my life would have been particularly different. And I remember walking the halls at the old castle on the hill, we call it, and seeing all the portraits of, definitely all the middle-aged famous white men with Orders of Australian medals, but reading about the things that they did, where they came from, how they did that, and being, I could be one of these people if only I tried and thought about it and found my way to chart that path in life.
How old were you then?
Year 9 it starts at, so that would have been 1999. I would have been 15 at the time.
Yep, that makes sense.
And so I graduated in 2002 from high school, so I would have been 18 at the time. So then I do the 2002 I graduated.
Okay. A lot of kids walk those halls, they see those kinds of photos, and they come from such contexts. And not many go on to take the initiatives that you've taken, including multiple entrepreneurial ventures, some which were not as successful, and now you're having great success in a couple of your entrepreneurial ventures, and congratulations. What do you think makes the difference? And before you answer that, by the way, I pulled up that quote, at least as it is in the Nomos Culture book, and it says, "I must study politics and war, that our children may study mathematics and commerce, that theirs might study painting, poetry, and music." And I think it's interesting what you said about all us being able to have the luxury of being able to study all three, and maybe we should, so that history doesn't repeat itself and we can be as best prepared as possible. It's interesting to me that John Adams, at least if that quote is as accurate as it is, he spoke about what we must study so that others may study it and have the luxury to study it. And I think that goes back to this notion of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that you need those certain foundations to be able to get to a point where you can think about self-actualization, or as we were talking about it, purpose. It doesn't mean that we can't think about optimizing security and improving self-sustenance and whatnot, but we certainly have the luxury of going up and down that ladder and developing many things on the way. But you would hope that, future generations can not have to study war and politics, not have to study institutional racism, not have to study systemic discrimination, which you and I still have to deal with.
Yeah.
So my question, going back to all of that, and maybe it's sort of related to those experiences that I alluded to, what do you think made the difference? Why did you walk through those halls and feel,
Well, to be clear, I don't think I'm smarter or better, and there's no value judgment in a difference between I and them. We are talking simply about differences. So if I try to put my finger on the things that I think are different, I would say that in my cohort plus 2 or 3 years, there are famous comedians. Kogan is Melbourne High boy, and I think he's younger than me, actually. So, he's a great Australian entrepreneurial success story, as is people like Lindsay Fox, etc. If I were to make some guesses, what many Melbourne High boys, even back as early as the 50s, etc., share, like whether they're Italians or Jews or Greeks that come, post Second World War, or at least when I was there, definitely like the Vietnamese, maybe a lot of Sri Lankans, etc., from various civil wars, etc. We all have that kind of intergenerational trauma that we inherit as a result of being refugees and people from so low socioeconomic backgrounds. We know where we came from. We know why this piece of bread is very precious, why that opportunity to learn is very precious. So to me, I think there are 2 things. Number one, your relationship with yourself and your capability and ability to grow it. Like, can you overcome that and be like, yes, you are the inheritor of all these various kinds of things. So what are you going to do? Leveraging maybe the raw intelligence that the Melbourne High or any other selective schools entrance exam, tests for, but to apply it to, like, I suppose, personal self-awareness intelligence. Aristotle said, all true knowledge starts with self-knowledge. And that's a big and long journey, at least for me, that is definitely decades in the making. And I would say that I didn't even really start that maybe until post-uni. I never really thought about improving or developing myself. So if you added that, if you talked to, interviewed, or looked at me at high school compared to any other Melbourne High boy, I don't think you would have been able to tell the difference.
Right.
The second thing that I think does make me different to them is, I would say, if you read Reinventing Organizations, for example, where they talk about the different mental modes. I forget that gentleman's name is. He talks about the different color modes and human ability to think about these things. When I talk to people about Cause Corps, for example, which is our micro-volunteering organization, we joke that there's a toothbrush metaphor. 100 years ago, no one brushed their teeth. You'd be a weirdo to even bother to try. In fact, it'd be really hard. But something happened in like 6 generations that made us want to do it. There are everything from education to doctors and dentists talking about it, the rise of entire professions, the rise of entire organizations like Colgate that sell you the tools to do it, etc. And parental teaching, etc. We've very successfully, young and old, across the world at the billion-person scale, changed the entire world's culture to make toothbrushing a normal thing. So at Course Core, we say the same thing, but we just replace the word dental hygiene and toothbrushing with caring about the world, civic engagement with the world, doing good things as an everyday habit, right? So what we want to do is give people toothbrushes, except those toothbrushes are walking a dog, a local dog that was abused by people in the, a dog pound and looking after them, writing a postcard that's, to a child that's sick in hospital, so that we can start each and every person on their journey for the thing they care about, whether that's animals or the environment or children, on this journey to making, to me, a multi-generational 100+ year change that one day our children's children will look back and be like, isn't it crazy that these people in 2021 were so preoccupied with this and that they didn't worry about what we, the people of 21, consider wholly normal things. So what I mean to say in a very long-winded way is that my frame of reference for improvement and impact and world-changingness is on the scale. If I compare myself to my peers and even other nomoses that I talk about, most people think about next week, next month. At best, they find it really hard to talk about 7 years. I know from talking to a lot of professional coaches, a lot of people find it really hard to talk about their own deaths in 2 or 3 or 5 decades or whatever. I'm thinking about when I've died and my daughter has died and her daughter has died. What's the world going to be like then? And I want to plant those trees now, because if I don't, who will? To me, that's a difference that I really feel in my life's journey. Those are the two big differences: the care about self-improvement to a very emotional, break yourself apart and put yourself back together in a way that you want to be, and keep doing that all the time, and be ultra long view. I always thought I did it as a kid. Like from about 18, I started doing 3-year plans for myself. Where do I want to be when I'm 21? 21, where do I want to be when I'm 24? I thought that was a very normal thing to do. I think I even learned it from a high school teacher. But then, it surprised me talking to other kids that they were like, that's weird, Steve. Like, no one does that. That was very surprising to me.
So around that time was the first time you started that. When did you realize that it was not just something that was weird and different, but it's something that was true to you?
Sure. That's a very good question. I think, and I'm sure this might resonate with you, a lot of adolescent energy, the moment you create the self-awareness, like, not a carefree kid at primary school, you don't even notice these things, but you hit even early puberty. If you are the face of the other, you live in a place like Australia, no matter what you do, you just look like somebody else. And the assumption that so many people have, whether racist or not, whether they see themselves as not, it is a racist assumption that by default of the way that your face looks, or the color of your skin, or the way that you dress, or the food you eat, that you just don't belong. So a lot of your adolescent energy is spent either proving that you belong or rejecting the idea. Sometimes both at the same time, sometimes much to the detriment of yourself. So I would definitely think that I spent a lot of energy, 8 to 22, really concerned about that, really worried about that, very almost reactionary to that. And it doesn't give you a lot of mental and personal energy to be like relaxed about that and then work on other things that might matter.
It's a preoccupation.
Yeah, it's a preoccupation. You worry about other things. And I'm sure if I told the 14-year-old myself, he'd be like, yeah, that's cool, old man, but I don't care about that. I'm very concerned with showing these Aussies that, like, I don't know, Chinese people can be this smart, or that, like, we can do this and we can do that. Like, that's what your energy is, right? But at some point in time in your life, you hit this point where you're like, oh man, I mean, it still matters. Yes, systematically, it still matters. But if you spend all of your time, all of your energy being just angry about that, the question is, what are you really doing about it for yourself and for others that might come? And so I still have a lot of energy for it. I've just redirected that energy from, say, self-flagellation or self-redefinition, and much more to building structures that it's more of a tent that I'd like other people to live in. So if you ask me about my early 20s, it would be like buying real expensive suits, man, to show you that I can, to show you where I've arrived, to show myself that I've done that. That's a certain expenditure of funds and energy. What do I do now? I don't need to buy Lamborghinis or suits. I'd stop wearing them, even though they're in the giant cupboard just over there. I spend my capital and my time and my energy saying, well, can I uplift future generations of people that are aspiring refugees? Can I ask 22-year-old kids, why do you really want to do what you want to do? Questions that I wish someone asked me at that time that changed my life. And building a structure to say, here's an example of a more human place to work. Here's an example of a more purposeful nonprofit, thus planting the trees that in the future people will be like, well, duh, of course that kind of organization should exist. That's only self-evident in hindsight, which of course for you as an Agilist and me as an Agilist, is the kind of thing we're always preaching about, right? You don't know that these things can exist until after they do. But that still means that someone has to make them in the first place. Trial and error. What does that mean?
Yeah, it definitely resonates with what you've said. I don't spend a lot of time thinking about this, but it occurs to me sometimes that I appreciated quite late that there was this refugee label that was missing from my life. And obviously, it was a privilege that my family didn't have to come here under refugee labels, but we certainly came under refugee circumstances. And I won't get into that right now, but I didn't learn until much later what kind of generational trauma, as you said, and vicarious trauma that I carried as well. And my siblings suddenly had even more of that because they were old enough to realize the violence and the circumstances that were occurring. But I was kind of blissfully ignorant of it. And yet I grew up with my parents and my elders telling me, don't forget, this is what you need to remember. This is your background. And for much of my childhood and to a great extent my teenage years, I was like, yeah, but is it really my background? How does it inform me? How does it inform my sense of identity? And it wasn't until I'd say maybe mid-20s I started to really appreciate that actually it does inform my identity, even if I wasn't in the same circumstances, dodging bullets or, hiding in neighbors' bunkers whilst other people from my ethnic community were being murdered. There was still definitely a part of me that carries those memories. We could talk about epigenetics and the influence of those. That probably had a great deal to define and shape my focus on individual identity, on figuring out my relationship to this concept of legacy. I know you didn't use that word, but to me, that is something that sits on the other side of self-actualization. And it occurs to me that's where your focus is, as you're saying, playing that, not just playing the long game, but really focusing on the long scale impact of what happens when you are self-actualized or in the pursuit of self-actualization. What does that mean in terms of the impact that you can leave behind in the world? And yeah, it's a really fascinating topic with lots of different branches to go down. I'm really curious. Your title at the moment.
I'm just going to turn on the light so you can see my face.
Yeah, sure.
One way that I talk to some of my staff about it is that, pick your Hollywood metaphor, Rick and Morty or Back to the Future. When people time travel, they're like, oh my God, don't step on that. Don't step on that butterfly. If you do, maybe the dinosaurs will come back or, the wrong person will be president or something like that, right? And that's funny, that's comedic. It's sort of time travelers. But actually, every single one of us is a time traveler from the world of 200 or whatever. Right now, if you step on that butterfly, start that business, don't do this, buy that house, do this thing, you have changed the future. So that is an act of imagination to be able to reframe the impact of your everyday in that sense. That is a very important personal mental exercise to achieve.
Yeah. So the thing that I was really curious to ask you based on this conversation was you spoke a lot about, at least I'm putting this word in your mouth, legacy, on the other side of self-actualization. And I think you talked about I think you used the word vision, but you suddenly used the word imagination.
Yes.
And it strikes me painfully that I see a lot of leaders in this day and age, particularly business leaders, but leaders who are in a position to have a lot of impact, not having that impact because they lack vision or they lack imagination. What they have is authority. They might even have compassion. They might actually care. They might give a shit, but they don't have vision. They're very sucked into the day-to-day. They're very sucked into the grind. And it might be the grind of growing if they're, a startup leader who happens to be in a space where they can have a great impact with their innovation. Or it might be the grind of accountability if they're in an existing institution and they care about the right things, they're in the right place at the right time, but their mentality is focused on either survival or it's focused on maintaining the status quo, risk aversion, and they don't have that vision. And I've often noticed that people who tend to climb the ranks and emerge into leadership positions of influential institutions, acknowledging that startups are a little bit different, they tend to become more and more risk averse, which also affects their ability to envision or imagine the way that you and I are talking about. And it's almost like they become more and more comfortable and it detaches them from the kind of appreciation and cognizance of that generational trauma or vicarious trauma or personal trauma that the likes of you and I hold on to, not begrudgingly, but just as an inspiration to say that, our previous generations, our ancestors went through certain struggles. We can aspire to make the world even better because of all the privileges that we have. And I'm wondering if there's a leader listening to this right now who acknowledges that, well, I don't want to step on a butterfly in the past or create a time machine, go back and have a really difficult life for the sake of inspiring vision and imagination. How can I escape the rut of risk aversion, attachment to accountability, and get the stone rolling again, so to speak? How can I do that? How can I inspire my own vision and imagination?
Okay, that's a very good question. I do want to give people some practical pro tips, but let me just go back a little bit and modulate the articulation of leaders. I think there can be leaders irrespective of their cultural and personal background. Whether you're white or middle-aged or not, certainly there are many people that come from different kinds of adversity, and that adversity can be very informative, that you will leverage it. And, everyone goes on their own journey. What is adversity to one person can be completely different for somebody else. There is no, you have to be a refugee in order to be successful at this stuff.
There's no measurement
of it. I suppose
it.
what I'm
Yes.
trying to get at. Precisely so. And it's not like mine is more precious than yours. You're on your own journey. And that's important to just embrace, accept, and love them for who they are and where they've come from.
Indeed.
So I would close off the idea that you have to deliberately put yourself or your child through some trauma school so that they can learn how to respond to it. But there certainly is ways that you can talk to them, grow them, and support them that are congruent with things like grit, like Angela Duckworth's grit. I'm sure you'll put it into the notes, as well as some practical tips to be gained by Dr. Carol Dweck's growth mindset, ways in which you can raise your child, talk to them, coach them, indeed coach your people and your staff, should you be in this people role, to create an environment in which it helps them build grit, it helps them encourage their growth mindset, etc. But let's talk about leaders for a second and leveraging imagination. Definitely, you may or may not know that I'm a science fiction nerd and have been ever since I was a kid, despite it being, quote unquote, a bit of a ghetto of literature. Like, I don't know, why is Charles Dickens or Jane Austen of higher literary value than Ursula Le Guin or Philip K. Dick? That's crazy to me that it's not, because I do consider the latter two authors to be just as equal, if not more, acts of abundant imagination to say, what if the world was politically like this? What if the world had gender like this? What if the world was not real? What does that mean? Those questions are the kind of questions that we need to ask, because more than ever, we need people with the capability to imagine ways in which our world could be better. That utopian strain of science fiction, as well as people to warn us against the dangers of building the wrong kind of structures in the wrong kind of world that people like Orwell were so good at doing. So yeah, I think the best part about imagination is that you can gain it. You can create empathy by reading stories, reading things that are of great literature, challenging yourself. I deleted most of my social media, for example, and I'm a Wikipedia junkie. Wikipedia is my social media. So I get bored. I'm not on Facebook posting about this and that. I mean, I'm on LinkedIn professionally, but if I have free time, I start by, I don't know, reading about an Italian singer. Before I know it, reading about Napoleon's battle tactics. 6 pages later, I'm, Royal Navy's size of ships and how they compare to each other.
Love those Wikipedia rabbit holes.
Curious rabbit holes, yeah. But pro tip for leaders listening to this. A different leader told me this that was kind of profound. Actually, it might have been my mum. It's kind of weird where I kind of get these things from. I would say that I'm much more a practicing Stoic, which is a school of Greek philosophy. You may be familiar with from Hollywood movies that are all about, as encapsulated by the Serenity Prayer and AA meetings, right? It's maybe a religious spin on what is a irreligious Greek philosophy. Lord, please grant me the strength to change the things that I can change, to the fortitude to endure the things that I can't, and then the wisdom to kind of work out which is which. In Stoic philosophy, that's called the dichotomy of control, things that you can control, things that you can't. In general, you can control if it's yours, your emotions, your reactions to things, how you think about something, what you do, how you plan, that sort of thing. You can't control other people, what they think, their opinions, and therefore the philosophy is all about cultivating things you do control and kind of ignoring things that you don't, and learning the act of discernment between those two. I actually think Buddhism is definitely the religious philosophy that my parents come from, at least my mum in a very strong way, is very similar to that. I mean, they have the Six Noble Four Path. They have things like that idea that being alive, part of the wheel of karma, is a cycle of suffering. I mean, that's very similar to the way that Stoics thought about the world. There are things that happen to you that are bad, that aren't within your control, etc. The conclusion, though, some kinds of Buddhists, particularly our like greater vehicle, what do they call it, Mahayana Buddhism, Chinese Buddhists think, is that like you can reach this level of enlightenment for which you can leave the world. I don't really know if I truly believe that, but certainly there's a thing that was said. The core of many people's lives, because the world is suffering, because bad things happen to you, because you got budgets due, stakeholders breathing down your back, employees that might leave, risk dangerous things, right? It's very easy, very human and evolutionary truth for us to work from the perspective of fear. Your base emotion is fear. Even when you read the newspaper, the rhetoric of our country's at war with this other country, you know, appeals to patriotism, appeals to, well, those things are appeals to fear very fundamentally, right? Your life will change if you make this huge leap to say, I will not have my decisions, my soul, my moral and ethical guidance, the things I do to treat my staff, my family, my organization, my stakeholders, be driven by fear. Taking it from either the Greek or the Buddhist perspective. The question is, what feeling, what human feeling do you replace it with? Instead of feeling fear when these things happen, what do you replace it with? I struggled with that for a very long time, and I almost didn't think that I was thinking about this. But the Buddhist answer is you replace it with compassion. You replace it with loving kindness. You replace it with like really, truly, if I can swear on this podcast, giving an S or an F about other people to the deepest and most holistic way you personally can. To me, when I say empathy in my bio, I do mean that, but maybe it's a slight softer word. So when you are a leader, and I hope that I can be a role model to leaders listening to this and thinking about that, how would you act in treatment of your stakeholders, designing your organization, preparing your budget, presenting to your board, looking after your staff? If every action that you had was way more congruent with loving kindness and compassion for each of those groups of people, rather than fear of what will they do, say, or think in reacting badly to your behaviors and your action. That is bone deep, soul deep, heart deep, morals deep. And to make that cognitive leap is the work of a lifetime. I still don't think I'm perfect at it. Still don't think I'm good at it. I talked to one of my directors the other day. He's like, Steve, the hardest, the most cultural aspect for me is abundance, because you know, I'm a 30-something person. I'm a director of a company. I still can't afford an Australian house. Like, that's how crazy things are. And I'm like, yeah, it's true. But when do you decide to act out of fear? I will take this profit so that I can do these things for myself, so that I have the security of shelter, which is quite low on the Maslow's hierarchy. It's very fundamental. It's animal deep. Versus what can I do to create wealth for many other people within our organization, and trust and believe that your act of doing that creates abundance, creates additional wealth that at some point, yes, you will take that to benefit yourself, and that can help everybody. That's an act of imagination. That's an act of vision. That's an act of trust. That's an act of loving kindness. That's bone deep to say you care about other people more than you fear for yourself.
I'm really in awe of your articulation of that. That's really very beautiful, actually. The philosophy is something that resonates with me, and it's not something that I haven't explored or considered before, but you've just said it in such an eloquent way that I hope it really lands for people who maybe have thought about thinking about it, but haven't really created the space for it. And it occurs to me that the thing that I take away from what you said is that you need to create the space for loving kindness, for compassion, by acknowledging that you're coming from a place of fear, and acknowledging and accepting that's perhaps getting in the way of your imagination and vision, or ability to imagine and ability to hold a vision long enough for you to then take compassion and loving kindness back to your workers, your stakeholders, your staff, and say, now I have the space to think about this. And it's a little bit about how we were talking earlier about being preoccupied with what other people might think about our belonging or not belonging when we're teenagers.
Yeah.
And, so much of your life gets caught up in that.
In the pursuit of that. I mean, I'll share that I'm a big nerd, right? Like I'm talking about playing Dungeons and Dragons,
really?
the RPG nerd since I was like 9. I thank my high school librarian for picking me out of that crew and be like, you're a kid that's gonna like it. And she gave me a personal copy of the original Dungeons and Dragons first edition red box, like 1972 type red box. Like, oh, changed my life. Talking about computer games, playing like, games in which you can be somebody else. Talking about reading literature, where you can walk a mile in the shoes of somebody else. If you feel like you lack or you want to grow the muscle of having empathy and compassion and understanding of somebody else, and it's the fear holds you back from doing that, role-playing, acting, playing computer games, reading narratives, literature of any kind is often a very safe window. Like my co-founder is big on indie films, and he says that he loves watching the film because some of it's a story. A lot of it is the mind of the director. What were they thinking? What's the story they're trying to tell, right? You want to walk a mile in their shoes, and it's safe and easy to do that versus, definitely doing it out in your normal, course of business. Perhaps I can brass tacks an example of compassion over fear. I would say that maybe 2 years ago, telling you raw stuff now, there was a period in which maybe Nomos's financial performance was not good. And definitely I'm accountable for a huge proportion, if not all of it. There's things that I didn't do, failed to learn in time to kind of save what I needed to save. Thank gosh that a lot of my previous energy in so many years building up to it was a very transparent conversation with staff. Hey, we're not here to make mega bucks. We are here to look after you, to grow you as people. And toward that end, we're going to make our entire salaries transparent, for example, so every Nomos knows what everybody else makes. So all of those, I felt that very principled wise, I should just do that because that's good human stuff that humans should do for each other. I've taken a fear of comparing themselves to others away from them. And so the net effect of us having a bit of an oh no moment, oh geez, we've got this much cash flow left in the business, it's going to be this bad if we don't take this kind of drastic action right now. In many other organizations, you would, and not to say that I didn't fear, definitely my heart dropped into my chest and I was like, oh crap, what do I do? Do I fire people? Do I fire myself? Do I do whatever? And I wouldn't say that even all my leaders loved what I did, but I kind of took it to the whole company and said, look, here's where we're at. Here's all the numbers that I have, and now you have it too. In some ways, you could see it as I made it their problem too. And that's true, I did. But they know that as part of our leadership and our kind care and consideration for them, we're telling them not to make them go away or strike fear in their hearts, although noting that our actions directly led to them doing that. But for the purpose of going, okay, well, what are we together going to do about it? Because I will do whatever it takes to help serve you. And what I found during that time is some people made the active choice to be like, look, I'm just going to leave. Clearly I'm a burden and cost to this business in this way. Clearly I don't generate this revenue. I kind of want to do these things in my life. Maybe I love this company, but you gave me the data to make that really hard decision for myself. That happened. A whole bunch of other people put their hand up and be like, yeah, I'll take a pay cut. Can we all take a pay cut? Huge numbers. Pretty much every Nomosa took a pay cut of one kind or other. I took the biggest pay cut of them all because, leaders got to do that kind of stuff. It definitely saw us through that period. It's not an all in it together. Some people selected out, some people selected in, and we all took a hit. These days, we're in almost the opposite of that position, right? We have, I wouldn't say we have so much money, but we're definitely in a huge position of abundance. We've paid everyone back so that no one's out of a pocket a cent that they lost from that. And indeed, we've recognized the people that have been on that journey with us, compensating them for that and their risk and trust and sharedness with us in their salaries. I think many organizations would find that a very difficult conversation to have, not that it wasn't difficult for us, but you probably wouldn't get the reaction in your organization that we got from people willing to put themselves at sacrifice in order to save the overarching company, especially if they know the company is using them as a means to an end, the end being profit, rather than the means of themselves, which is definitely, I'm sure you put the reference in there, an Immanuel Kant categorical imperative, moral imperative, how to be a good person even as you become a leader with authority and capability to control others.
That's very interesting. I think sometimes people find it a conundrum. When I say people, I mean leaders find it a conundrum, a dilemma, a paradox to consider their moral imperative to be a good person compared to being a good. I hear this term. A few people have said it, including people I admire very much, and it always rubs me the wrong way. A good corporate citizen, a good institutional team player, a good person that is supportive of the overall ecosystem of a very large system that you operate in. There's something in me innately that feels like disruption or agitation has a place, and there needs to be room created for safely doing that as well. And some leaders can find themselves in a position of either or. Either they're creating space and time for the moral imperative. How do I become a good person in order to be a better leader? Or how do I make sure I'm acting as a good corporate citizen, which puts them back into that path of, well, I'll say fear generally, but it can manifest in ways of risk aversion, a stronger reporting culture, top-down management styles, all of those things. So I find that whole concept of designing how you're going to lead and where moral philosophy comes into it really interesting. And this is probably a good segue to a fundamental question I'm interested in asking anyone that I interview. This show is called Lead by Design. What does it mean to you to lead by design? How do you recognize it? So how do you recognize when someone is leading by design? And what does it look like when someone is not leading by design? So they're leading, but it's not by design.
Sure. That's a great question. I would share that when I did the Sustainable Business Strategy course with Professor Rebecca Henderson at Harvard. I didn't love it, but there are certainly things that I learned from it. And one thing that I really admired that she talked about, she made pains to talk about, was just how toxic, at least to the American corporation, the ideas of the economist Milton Friedman was to CEOs. He being the one of the idea that is the CEO's highest purpose is to generate value for stakeholders. That being kind of your statement about being good corporate citizens. And she strongly articulated to everyone that attended her course that actually that might be a philosophy, but there's nothing enshrined in law that says you have to do that. I recognize there may be things enshrined in any leader listening in your constitution that forces you to do that, or your organization's charter. But conversely, there are a lot of organizations that have charters that are exactly the opposite. Like I know that my organization has recently updated our constitution to align to B Corp principles, and I hope that you'd put that in your thing too. And one of those is every director in the company has a duty and an obligation to consider the people, the environment, the long-term, whatever, of any decision that you make an impact, so that, if you, the king, quote unquote, isn't going to change the rules around you to enable you to be a leader by design, who is going to change it? Who has more power than you? Nobody. You have to be a leader in starting that conversation with your board, with your stakeholders, with the people with the power to change that constitution. Obviously, it's easier for me because I'm a founder, owner, and CEO. Definitely, I recognize for different companies that can be much harder. But then to answer your question, how do I know that someone's leading by design and someone's not? I feel like you wouldn't be if you're doing it because you felt like you have to. Coming back to that stoic statement, if you're responding to things not within your control, rather than saying, here's the 7 whys of why I designed it that way, then yeah, I actually think you're not leading. You're leading by reacting, or you're running by reacting, or you're directing by reacting. I don't think that you're leading by design. To design something is to have intentionality, right? To say, I will design a chair that is good for humans that, curve their butt in just this way. I will design a light that makes humans feel this or that way. So you can design an organization, the elements inside it, the way that the organization treats people when you're not around, via things like its processes, via things like its organizational culture, in such a way as that design is a leadership for even when you're not there. That's what's going to happen. So some real examples of that. I mean, Nomos designs its organization. Top 3 things here are, it designs it for purpose. So we have a mechanism where on top of performance planning, we way more do purpose planning. We ask you the question every 6 weeks. We build you our purpose planning mechanisms and tools and stuff that we use is more rigorous than our KPIs, and is more rigorous than most organizations' KPI schema. As in, I will more metricize, measure, and check with you your degree of self-actualization, whether you went on the journey or not. Not that you have to, but I'm just going to ask you to remember mutual and informed consent type thing. Then I care about your OKRs or your KPIs. That's a design element. And it's got such a life of its own that if I took it away as a CEO or I just stopped doing it, there would totally be a revolt inside Nomos. Be like, why are we stopping this thing? We design for agility. We assume that every team, whether they're in-house, out on client side or whatever, runs in some kind of agile-ish way, and we provide people with the training for that. Like, why would you not do it in an agile way? We design it for teal, like self-actualization, psychological safety, bring the whole of yourself to work. Again, there's a whole set of things that we do in order to afford that. But if one day we said, we don't care about your wholeness at work, again, there would be almost a cultural riot within the organization. So all of those things are a deliberate act of design. And if you ask me, why do I design for a purpose? Because I think it's human. I think that's how if you find purposeful people, grow their purpose, they will exponentially outperform any other person. Why do we do agility? I think it's a way of working that exponentially outperforms others. Why do you do teal? I think it's the future of the way that any organization is going to want to work. So we want to work it out first, that being a competitive advantage. So and if you ask me why those, I've got reasons for that too. So to me, that feels like a real exercise in intentional design with the articulated elements, including mechanisms to support whatever design it is that you're putting in place. And it is a kind of leadership by a kind of process. There are other angles, things like tribe, as in who we hire, who we keep in our ecosystem, who we have around us, selecting people and getting them to lead each other as a kind of leadership. We select people that have growth mindset. We select people that have abundance attitude. We select people that step up to the responsibility they're given, and they will do what we call positive freedom. Again, I'm sure you'll put a link in there. Rather than negative freedom, they are their own master. They're very good at making active choices rather than responding to whatever the environment tells them to do. That's really hard. And that to me is what I'm articulating in a leadership mentality. I think I'm a person that is obsessed with positive choice. I don't want to let other people choose for me, and I'm never going to just let it go. I will always work the muscle of make an active choice. So yeah, I think leaders need to pick the things that they're designing for. I think they need to be intentional about it. I think they need to say why. And I have 6 examples of 3 things that you do to the organization and its processes, and 3 examples of the kind of things that you do to design the people that you hire, because they will be self-propagating. That if you hire a certain personality type or a mindset type, they will find more people like that. And indeed, your referrals will keep that thing going.
Okay. Sorry, are those examples you can share?
Oh yeah, so the people who have growth mindset, people who are abundant, who have privilege and responsibility. Examples are like, definitely one of our first hires is someone who was very young and sort of looking for their purpose in the world. She's been with us 7 years now, and she's done everything from graphic design to more artistic things, to more graphic design, to more UX things. And these days, within the course of those 7 years, we made it safe enough for her and assured her the economics of her search such that she could continuously have a job with us. We could continue to grow value together. And now I'm very proud of her. She's probably one of the best behavioral consultants that we have. Her ability to manage expectations as a consultant is nearly second to none, simply by virtue of her being around a long time and exercising those skills in different domains. But her secondary skill is probably the one that's newest, where she's growing and learning how to be more of a front-end developer. And that is an example of a person that embraces the growth mindset, follows their purpose every day, and we've created an environment in which it's cool and safe and able. Other examples include dropping out people or making it really easy for them to leave if they're just not right culturally or not right purpose-wise. We had a software developer who joined and, perky, bright-eyed, fresh-faced type person whose performance steadily deteriorated over time. Obviously, we had ongoing conversations about what their purpose was, and what they really cared about was fake news. They were like, I hate it. Why is the world like that? Fake news is a scourge on society. And, probably they didn't discover how much they really cared about that until we started almost forcing that conversation. So one day, maybe it's like only 3 months in or so, while they're still in their probation period, right? We're like, hey, like, you've been talking about this for at least every session of our purpose chat for the last 3 sessions. Like, that Nomos does nothing. We don't have any clients, or we don't have an internal agenda to combat fake news. would you like us to support you with something? He's like, no. Actually, what I should go is go and get a job at this media company or that so that I can do something about it. We're like, yeah, should you? And it was a purpose chat, which is all about self-actualizing them. But they basically fired themselves, or they discovered that they wanted to leave in that conversation, in the moment, in the middle of the conversation. It's one of the only purpose chats, definitely one of the only let someone go conversations where we both left kind of laughing because they were like, oh my God, I'm glad I discovered that. And we're glad that we discovered that because, I mean, I guess he was a performant employee. I could have used him to extract value as a consultant, but I definitely wouldn't have self-actualized them. They wouldn't have matched this thing. They would have been toxic in the context of all these other people chasing what their purpose was. So they had to drop out and they selected the dropout, not me. So those are examples of how differently effective the right kind of design has, so that whether I'm there or not, the organization can continue to grow and be nurtured in the way that I originally designed it to be.
There's a quote I've been thinking of lately that I've shared quite a bit in the context of my coaching. It's attributed to W. Edwards Deming, but that's a little bit contentious, which is every system is perfectly designed to get the results it gets. And this conversation had made me think about how every leadership is designed to get the impact it gets. I think we take it for granted. Even a lot of leaders that I've worked with assume that the system design can somehow correct any abstractions in their leadership, any vagueness or lack of design or just reactivity, as you said, being the opposite of leading by design, leading by reaction. Designing an ideal system, including tools and infrastructure, as well as cultural values and whatnot, can kind of wash away the abstraction or ambiguity of a leader not leading by design. And yeah, it's just occurred to me that it's actually really important to perhaps even, and I'm not committed to this yet because I'm just exploring it, perhaps even to start by designing the leadership before you design the system. Any thoughts?
If you don't know who you want to be as a leader, how will you know what kind of organization you will lead? Or indeed where you will lead that organization? That's like a fundamental question, isn't it?
It is. I don't know if this is in contrast, but Frederick Laloux, the author of Reinventing Organizations, who speaks about teal organizations, he has this quote from that book: "If employees need to be empowered, it is because the system's very design concentrates power at the top."
Yes.
I've always found that really interesting and a little bit challenging as well. And the reason I bring it up now is because it sits interestingly, potentially contrasting to this idea of starting with the design of the leadership. And I remember you and I were talking, I can't remember, last week or a couple of weeks ago, and you made this passing comment about the culture that you're building in the organization and how it's very anti-cult and by design, except for the charismatic leaders at the top. You can't really avoid that. That's helpful. And I can see the virtue of that. I've certainly seen it and experienced it myself. But yeah, it's interesting. I've been exploring this idea that there are people who lead from behind and there are people who lead from the front. And when you lead from the front, if someone is consistently charismatically leading from the front and then they step away, you start to notice how dependent employees become on being empowered as opposed to self-empowering. And we're close to time, but this is certainly prompting me to think about a whole bunch of other things that I wanted to ask you and talk to you about, including self-management. That's a huge topic in and of itself. But I want to ask you one thing. And this might not be related to this, but maybe we can tie it in somehow. Circling back to this notion of leading by design and integrating compassion and loving kindness, replacing this place of fear with that. I've noticed recently, Stephen, you've become much more articulate and expressive of the issues that you have with systemic racism, which obviously I completely relate to and support based on my own experiences of growing up in Australia and certain experiences of racism and bullying that I've experienced, as well as just people not really getting it. There's this problem of people being racist, and then there's a problem of others that are not quite apologists, but they just don't quite get it. And they think that they get it, but they don't quite get it. And it's really hard for me to articulate what I'm talking about, but I know that you understand what I'm saying, and some of the listeners will understand what I'm alluding to as well. How do you bring loving kindness and compassion to the design of your leadership, or even the design of your moral construct, if you will, as a person, and not get the realities of those things still being pervasive and persistent, despite what your parents and what their parents went through? How do you not let that get in the way?
Ooh, that's a big question. I want to give your listeners lots of different kinds of value on the previous topic about how do you empower people. If you read that Lulu book, which is free to pay what you like, by the way, so you can download the PDF for it, the most powerful exercise you can do, by the way, is the advice process, which is anyone can decide anything, but they need to talk to and ask people who are experts at it, as well as the people who are impacted by it before they make the decision. There's a lot of humility. There's a lot of mutual learning. It's pretty fun. There's a lot of growth in people doing that. It helps you decentralize decision-making. Powerful tip on that previous.
Good call. Yeah.
The next one, which is maybe the subtext of some of your question, is how do you talk to people who may have racist attitudes, maybe part of a racist system, but if you even use the word racism, you get this shut down. Like they don't want to listen. They're not going to get it. There's just, etc. There's a wonderful book that came out only a year or two ago, 3 years ago actually now, called White Fragility, written by a white person trying to talk to other people about like issues of race and diversity, etc. And it's a very important phrase that I'd love people to read on their own. And I paraphrase, I don't remember exactly word what it is, but it's something like, sure, I'm talking to you about racism, and I don't mean you are some pitchfork burning moral judgment person where you deliberately intended to hurt, injure, slander, or otherwise, judge somebody on the basis of race. We understand, you and I, this person that we're talking to and trying to educate, that is a definition of racism. And I understand that if we were talking about the definition of racism, you are not a racist. And that's not the definition of racism that I'm talking about. So, can we together for a moment recognize that? And I'm not taking that. I'm not saying you are morally and ethically bad in some way as a racist. I am saying there are systems, there are attitudes, that there are behaviors that, if unexamined, are racist in and of themselves, and you can almost be an accidental carrier of those things. And it is not a moral and or personal judgment of you to be a carrier of these ideas and these thinking, etc. That phrase has been very powerful for me, talking to whether it's staff or stakeholders or others in conversations about this, where it's you leave the burden aside of, but I'm not a racist, and you can get over that conversation and have one that is more constructive.
Could you repeat the phrase slowly for the benefit of listeners?
Yeah,
I think it needs to land.
I paraphrase. Let's share the exact phrasing for it, but it's something like, there is a definition of racism that is, you seek by intent to hurt, injure, be prejudiced against someone on the basis of their race and the color of skin. If you believe that's the kind of racism, yes, that is the definition of the word, by the way, then if you did all those things, yes, that would be a personal moral judgment. When we are talking about race and racism, we don't use that definition, but that is a definition, but that's not the one that we are most concerned with. We're most concerned with racism as it pertains to a culture, a mindset, a systemic and systematic set of prejudices and biases and etc. that almost accidentally, through no fault and personal decision of your own, you are an inheritor and a part of. That's the racism that I want to talk to you about. I want to make you an ally for, and that's the racism that we can use as a way of moving forward. So you might say and do racist things, and I'm not saying that you are racist as a result of doing that, but definitely you said and did those racist things, maybe nearly accidentally. And now we're having a conversation about why those things are racist so we can grow together.
Thank you. Thank you. Oh man, there's so much to talk about this. I have a personal issue that I've recently come to identify with this concept that Australians talk about a lot, casual racism. Yes. I think we need to clean up our vocabulary, because this kind of racism that you've just described in that phrasing, I find personally is so much more insidious. When racism is at your face, you can deal with it through law and order. You can deal with it through being able to call it out. But when racism can get marked as casual racism, it's almost,
Yeah.
it
Oh, the
almost
answer
puts
is it's just a joke,
responsibility.
mate. It's like,
It's just
yeah,
a
yeah,
joke, man.
I know it's just a joke, mate. And I know that you are not a racist, having had made said joke, but understand that joke is racist and it relies
Exactly.
on tropes that are racist, and you are a carrier of that. And that's a different, if you can use the first phrase, you can flip the conversation.
Yeah. No,
Sometimes. You can
that's
also fail a
fantastic.
lot of
Well,
times.
oh, totally. And look, I have, and you know what? I have to admit and acknowledge, for anyone who's listening to this, has known me for long enough, I've fallen victim to that myself, in terms of I've expressed casual racism and not realized it because of the culture and system that I grew up in, and something that I've had to take responsibility for, not realizing, thinking that it's just a joke, mate. So it's been, yeah, quite a confronting thing for me to look back now and realize that, oh, damn, 7 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, when I said that thing to a friend of mine and he was upset. And in my mind, I apologized at face value, but in my mind, I was thinking, why was he upset? It was just a joke. And now we're growing in society and realizing how detrimental and hurtful those things can be. I'm starting to appreciate that, yeah, this term casual racism is way too casual. Definitely need to do something.
I am on the same page with you. I too, like, no one's some golden child at this, right? Like, definitely I have been a instigator and carrier of casually sexist ideas, casually, I don't know, anti-trans ideas, casually anti-Semitic ideas. Definitely. At some point, I'll be like, oh, it's just a joke, right? But that's not cool. And part of it is recognizing that that's not cool and understanding that if someone says that I'm racist or gender biased or misogynist or whatever, they don't mean, at least in that context, that I am morally and ethically bad. It does mean the attitude is, as is the joke, and I should do things to talk with, educate myself, and unprejudice myself against those nearly invisible biases.
Yeah. And I would go so far as to say that this is a topic and an issue that is symptomatic of something that is very fundamental to the culture of fear that seeps into everyone's lives, but particularly leaders as well. And if you want to, if you're listening to this and you're a leader and you're thinking, how can I clear that space that we were talking about from fear to try and make way for compassion and loving kindness? I think there's a responsibility that you need to take on to confront these things that are cultural and societal in nature. And somewhere or other, they're probably taking up a little space in your mind that are detracting you from being as compassionate as you could be. That, as we've discussed, get in the way of imagination and having vision.
Let me tackle the last part of maybe the thrust of your question, because I kind of hijacked it in a slightly different thing, which let me repeat to make sure that I understood it, was that sometimes we may have staff or employees or people that we work with, leaders too, who feel like they're still getting over like racism or something. How do I help them? How do we grow them such that that's less of a concern? Is that the main question?
To be honest with you, that wasn't the question that I was asking, but your answer was so valuable and enriched that it inspired me to carry it forward. The question I was asking is, for you personally, specifically, you've been more vocal and expressive about your feelings and sentiments towards these things. So let me put it in a really plain language way. How do you not get pissed off in such a way that it affects your ability to maintain compassion and loving kindness when you're increasingly putting yourself in the line of fire and putting yourself out there and confronting these issues?
That's a good question.
Does that make sense?
Yes, of course it does. Thank you. I think that being a deliberate leader, making active choices about what you will fight and what you won't fight. You can't fight every battle all at the same time, right? You kind of got to pick which ones you care about right now and which ones you're going to fight. So I know I fight extractive capitalism. My LinkedIn is very strong about that. I fight things like worker exploitation, which is a form of extractive capitalism. And I fight some kinds of inequality. I mean, I don't know enough about diverse sexuality, for example, to be a good proponent of that fight, but definitely gender diversity, socioeconomic diversity, racial diversity. So I've chosen those fights, if that makes sense. And then so I made an active choice and I'm going to keep up that good fight. B, I obviously apply a lot of self-care. Definitely, I was in a accidental long conversation with someone who wanted to defend genocide on the LinkedIn of all places, on the literal day after of the anniversary of Tiananmen, which is very emotionally draining, right? So part B, definitely you need to do things to look after yourself, to turn said social media off. Sometimes you just need to stop the fight for a little while so you can go back to home base, rest and recoup before you come back again. I think the last one is back to the stoicism tip, which is there are things that you can control and things that you can't. You can't control the opinions of others, their weird biases, the inherent and systemic racism. You can control your role modeling for it, which battles you choose to fight, when you engage, when you don't, what you say when you engage, how you engage. You can control all that because those things are wholly and complete within your control. So I think about these battles that I want to fight. Number one, did I choose them? Sometimes I'm allowed to say, well, I unchoose them for a little while. I'm just exhausted from that battle. B, am I looking after myself? Does the battle come at detriment of me continuing to fight said battle? And C, are the things that I'm worrying about or emotional about things that are actually within my control? Because I should really just focus on the things that are within my control.
Thank you. That's a really nice way to tie that up. Stephen, this has been an incredibly rich conversation. There are so many things that I've got in my notes specifically that I wanted to ask you and talk to you about that we don't have time this, at the moment. If we have a future opportunity, I'd love to have you back and we can continue the conversation. In fact, I'd like to give you a little bit of a teaser about the things that I did want to ask you. So I'm really curious to talk to you about eudaimonia, bricolage, and gratia. They're concepts that are talked about in your culture book as well. I'm very curious to ask you what happened in 2014 when you moved into Taiwan, into Vietnam, sorry, I think it was, with Harvey Nash. I think that was your first director of agility role. Very curious to explore the story around that time. Interested in talking to you about some of the concepts from some of the authors that we both admire mutually. Particularly, I had some quotes from Daniel Pink and also Nassim Taleb from Anti-Fragile as well. And actually, there's a big quote, so I won't read it right now. I'll save it for next time. But it prompted me to talk to you about. Actually, I'll read a part of this quote. This will be interesting. So the quote that I had in my notes was longer, but a part of it from Anti-Fragile was where Nassim Taleb wrote, "As a child of civil war, I disbelieve in structured learning. Provided we have the right type of rigor, we need randomness, mess, adventures, uncertainty, self-discovery, near-traumatic episodes, all those things that make life worth living compared to the structured, fake, and ineffective life of an empty suit CEO with a preset schedule and an alarm clock." And I love the context of this quote as well, so maybe next time we can talk about it more broadly. And I'm keen to ask you about your experiences of taking the moral philosophy that you explore into parenting as a father of a young child and one on the way. I'm very curious about that. And I know you've got one of your roles on LinkedIn even is house husband, and very curious to unpack that as well. And would love to share with the audience more about Cause Corps. So there's a lot to talk about, and I'm looking forward to further conversations, both in recording and off session as well, as we get to know each other better and better. In wrapping up, is there anything that you would like to say, anything you'd like to ask me, anything that you would like to promote that you have coming up, anything at all?
Thank you for the opportunity to do so. I would say, let's definitely do another 1 to however many sessions you feel like we need to. I'm here to serve. I'm here to teach. If people like the ideas, I'm happy to talk about it at length. B, thank you very much for the privilege, the honor, the opportunity to come and speak to the people that listen to your wonderful podcast. The depth of research and the great questions has been very humbling to me. And so I don't take your trust in me to treat this interaction with the highest of care and consideration lightly in any way. So thank you to, and also all those people who are listening. I don't really have that much to plug. Postnomos is hiring. We're always hiring for lots of different types of role, everything from interns to software developers to agile coaches. If this changed your life and you kind of want to look at opportunity to do something different, we'd love to talk to you. Of course, we'd love to always have more customers. If you're like, hey, can you help me coach and grow on my leadership journey? Can you help my organization do that? That is our bread and butter. So we'd love to do that if you wanted to. I just came back off the back of again, it's an accident. I didn't deliberately start a games company, but I did as a result of the people that work there. Because I have a games company and we teach Agile, didn't intend or design that we would have a game that uses a Nintendo to teach the game, but here we are. And I just came back from New Zealand teaching a large client doing that. And it's the first time ever we had a perfect, I'm talking 100% NPS score out of 20 plus people. Everyone gave us a 9 out of 10 with their recommended to friends and whatnot. It's pretty cool. I know, Dev, you've experienced it too. Anyone that wants to kind of get in on that, we've priced it in such a way it's very easy for groups of people to get in on it. That's a very easy way to talk to us. Last but not least, if you are interested in Cause Core, that's Cause Core spelled like Peace Corps, like CAUSECORPS. We are just restarting it post-COVID, giving a COVID-friendly, webinar-based opportunity for people to volunteer and to make an act of doing good a daily habit over the course of the next 3 weeks. If you Google that word, Cause Core, you will find us on Meetup. We've got chapters all over the world, but we're running worldwide events. Write postcards to sick kids in hospital, write letters to people suffering from poor mental health and just want some human connection. There's very practical ways that are short in time, zero in cost, very direct action. You can touch and impact causes that you care about, from the safety, the COVID safety of your own home, over a Zoom call with 50, 100 other people from all across the world doing it at the same time. So if you're interested, do Google it. I'm sure you'll put the links to this kind of stuff at the end.
Stephen, thanks again. Really looking forward to our next conversation. This has been fantastic. And thanks a ton, man.
Thank you for having me. Speak soon.
Thanks for making it to the end of this episode. You'll be able to find the show notes and more at my website over at leadbydesign.show. I really hope you enjoyed this, and if you did, then I have a request for you. Subscribe to the podcast wherever you're watching or listening to it, and share this episode with someone directly who you believe would benefit from this conversation. Thanks for listening.